For over 20 years, the Japanese have been planning this airport, which rightfully ended up being one of the most impressive projects of its time. Groundbreaking ways to handle drainage were tried out for the first time in challenging and unique conditions. Millions of tons of dirt, concrete, and other building materials were dumped into the waters of Osaka Bay, forming two man-made islands. 10,000 workers, almost 100 machines. This is the story of Kansai Airport in Osaka. The whole construction cost over $20 billion, making the Japanese project one of the most expensive in civil engineering history. But you know what? All that effort and money poured into this grand project could just end up underwater. Quite literally. Kansai Airport is sinking. The very first question that might pop into your head when you see an airport on the water is, why did they even build it there? Osaka naturally had an airport before this. That would be Atami, or Osaka International Airport, which has been around since 1939. Basically, if humanity's technological progress had stopped, this airport would still meet the city's needs today. However, at some point, giant jet planes became widespread. Atami Airport was built for those aircraft, which now look like tiny toys. Well, they could have just expanded it, right? Why build a new airport on the water? Sure, you can expand some airports, but not Atami. Take a step left from the airport, there's a building. Take a step right, another building. Wherever you step, there's some kind of building. In short, there was no way to expand the airport, so they decided to go a different route. But maybe they could have built an airport on land. Why go straight into the water? The thing is, Osaka uses up literally all the mountain-free area that could be built up. Everywhere you look, there's not a single empty spot. The Japanese make the most out of every little patch of land. Basically, there was just nowhere left to build, so the new airport ended up on the water. By the way, there was another reason why they didn't even try building the airport somewhere within the city limits. The first jet plane landed at Atami Airport on June 1st, 1964. That's when the complaints about noise pollution started. You get it, those planes are insanely loud even when they're taking off far away, let alone right next to people's homes. And later, it was the same noise issue that sparked protests in Tokyo, where people opposed building a new airport within the city. Basically, the only option was water. And as for the challenges, well, before the Kansai Airport, nobody had ever built such structures on water. That's actually why it took 20 years from the decision to build an airport on water to the start of construction. They started building Kansai only in 1987. Over the past 20 years, the project team has figured out the location. It's right here. They've also realized what challenges they'd face during construction. However, 20 years of research wasn't enough to stop the airport from sinking. Actually, no one really expected the artificial island to stay above water. The thing is, they chose to create artificial land in a spot with a 66-foot layer of Holocene clay at the bottom. And that's, to put it mildly, a difficult surface to build on. Imagine a sponge that soaked up water. A light press and the water pours out while its original shape is lost. The same goes for clay, especially Holocene clay. It holds 70% of moisture, and here they need to build an island with an airport. The problem, seemingly difficult to solve, is just another reason to think about whether it would have been better to build the airport somewhere on land. However, the Japanese figured out how to make it work, and they even predicted that the airport would sink evenly over the course of 50 years, eventually stabilizing at a height of 13 feet above sea level. Keep this information in mind, it'll be important later. The Japanese started the construction by laying a 5-foot layer of sand over an area of about 2 square miles. That was the planned size of the island. After that, they drove around 1 million vertical pipes through the sand into the Holocene clay and then covered it all with more sand. After all of this, the island had to be raised to a height of 120 feet from the seafloor. How much soil would that require? Just a reminder, the island's area has to be 2 square miles. That means a whole lot of soil. But it also took a huge amount of effort and resources to build a seawall around the perimeter of the future island. They coped with this. The Japanese laid down rocks and added 48,000 concrete tetrapods, those things that dissipate the waves, dispersing their force. Then the workers got started on the massive earthworks. Engineers and builders dug soil from Osaka Bay and mined it from nearby mountain quarries. On top of that, building material for the future airport island was even brought from China and Korea. In total, they dug up and used 6 billion cubic feet of soil for the island. What can you compare it to? Well, for example, with the 72 Great Pyramids of Giza, each with a volume of 88 million cubic feet. Now imagine how much effort and resources were spent. In fact, you don't even need to imagine it. Over the course of 3 years from start to finish, 10,000 workers were involved, using 80 ships and putting in 10 million man-hours. So what's the point of putting sand at the bottom, driving vertical pipes into it, and then covering everything with millions of cubic feet of dirt? Actually, it's pretty simple. The dumped soil presses down on the clay, and the clay, in turn, releases all its moisture through the pipes. Thanks to this, the clay layer gets compacted, becoming tougher and less prone to deformation. To put it simply, the Japanese experts sped up the natural process of sedimentation. Without this artificial acceleration, the clay would have settled over decades. But with the boost, everything was done in just 1 year, making the island safe for construction just 3 years after the work started, which was in 1990. Thinking that everything was going well, in 1990, the Japanese built a 2-mile-long bridge that connected the island to the mainland in the town of Rinku. By the way, it cost $1 billion, another pricey addition to an island that, even without an airport, was already worth $14 billion at the time, or nearly $40 billion when adjusted for today's exchange rate. Then everything went according to plan. In 1991, the terminal construction started. Of course, it was also designed with the idea that the island would be settling over 50 years until it reaches that 13-foot mark above sea level. Adjustable columns were designed to support the building, which can be extended by inserting thick metal plates into their bases. In 1994, the airport finally opened. It became a great replacement for that same Osaka International Airport. It operated 24/7. By the way, Kansai became the first in Japan to do so. There was no noise bothering residents because the airport was far away. And 31 airlines from 26 countries immediately started flying there. They continued to consider the construction of the first water-based airport as grand and so reliable that nothing could hurt it. But then came 1995, and what happened next was typical for Japan. Of course, we're talking about an earthquake. In Japan, they happen so often that the map showing seismic events and magnitudes from 1900 to 2016 is literally filled with dots. And one of them occurred in 1995 with a magnitude of 7.3. This was the Great Henshin earthquake. No, the airport didn't start sinking. At that moment, people were even more impressed by its design. The earthquake was so powerful that 6,434 people were killed on the main island of Japan, Honshu. What happened to Kansai Airport during this time? Absolutely nothing. Not even a single window cracked. And by the way, it was only 12 miles away from the epicenter, so it seemed like the damage should have been critical. But during the construction, they also made sure to protect it against earthquakes. Then there was another reason to be amazed when Kansai Airport survived the 1998 typhoon with wind speeds over 134 miles per hour. The waves and everything else that comes with such a destructive natural event caused no damage to the airport, thanks to its sturdy design and that very seawall with tetrapods. By that time, everyone was totally convinced the airport would never be harmed by anything. It'll outlast everything, and the settlement's going as planned. However, as it turned out, everything is completely different from the forecast set by the Japanese engineers and everyone else involved in the project. The creators thought that by 1999, the island should sink by 19 feet, but it turned out it had actually dropped by 27 feet, almost 50% more than planned. Clearly, something had to be done about it. The workers dug the foundation pit for the passenger terminal, inserted steel plates under the hydraulic jacks, and then gradually lifted the columns. But then came a surprise. The accelerated settling of the Holocene clay was over, but no one expected the next clay layer to move so actively. That is the Pleistocene one. The very same Holocene clay layer is the newest of all the layers. It was formed no more than 12,000 years ago. The Pleistocene epoch, in turn, started about 2.6 million years ago and lasted until the beginning of the Holocene. So this bottom layer appeared much earlier. Because of that, the layer is so thick and solid that no soil transformation, like the one the Japanese did with the top clay, will work in any scenario. It sinks naturally over a long period of time. Actually, the Pleistocene layer moves slowly, but the Japanese decided to build their own artificial island, piling up 6 billion cubic feet of soil. Do you get where we're going with this? It made even such a thick layer sink faster. Here, for example, you can clearly see how slow the movement was before the construction started and how much faster it got once they were already building the island. What can you do about it? Nothing. Because before the construction, it was impossible to speed up the settling of the layer. Now you can't speed it up either. The airport on the island is already there, so they'd have to redo everything. All that's left is to constantly adjust the 900 jacks the terminal sits on and hope nothing happens to the flexible asphalt. They used it for the runway to prevent it from falling apart due to the shifting island beneath it. Oh, and also they have to keep building up the seawall that protects the airport from wave damage. However, there's one big problem even with this kind of protection against settling. The island sinks unevenly. For example, the center of the Kansai passenger terminal sinks faster than other parts of the building. This really complicates the efforts to minimize the effects of the sinking. In 2000, the island sank simply due to the movement of the Pleistocene layer by over 20 feet. But the airport was operating at full capacity during peak hours, so in 2003, the decision was made. The sinking problem was almost resolved. It was time to build a second runway, 13,120 feet long, and therefore another island was needed, which would also gradually sink. The builders piled up the sand again, set up the drainage, fenced it off with a seawall, and dumped an enormous amount of soil. As a result, the second runway opened in 2007, and the second terminal opened in 2012. The airport expanded from 2 square miles to 4 square miles, and the total cost of the project went up by another $8 billion, reaching $20 billion. Meanwhile, measurements made in 2015 showed that the first island had already settled by 43 feet since construction started and by 32 feet by the time it opened. However, the settling is slowing down, which is a bit reassuring. Still, some experts said that all parts of the airport will be at sea level by 2056. In any case, there's still time to think, observe, and then if needed, remake the islands. Gholam Reza Mesri, a professor of engineering at the University of Illinois, said in 2018 that the exact spot 13 feet above sea level would be reached by 2023, and any typhoon hitting Kansai would no longer be held back by the seawall, and the runways and buildings would end up underwater. Yes, this is the mark that was originally expected to be reached in 50 years. The scariest thing is that in the same 2018, when the professor talked about the year 2023, Typhoon Jebi hit. It became the most expensive disaster in terms of insured losses, and it wasn't just by chance. Jebi was the strongest typhoon to hit Japan since 1993, and it was even given the highest category on the Saffir-Simpson scale. And no, this time the airport wasn't something to marvel at like it was during earlier events. This time a wave of seawater flooded the island, damaged the runways and planes. And there was also the time when a tanker crashed into the bridge connecting the airport to the mainland. That's when people found themselves cut off from the outside world on the islands. It's a really bad situation. The worst part is that the airport on the artificial island keeps sinking, and by 2018 it was at the level where it could be flooded. And this is happening even though 75 airlines from various countries all over the world are using it right now. But let's take a closer look at what happened to the airport after the typhoon. They raised the seawall, plus they changed the airport's drainage system, but there are still frequent forecasts about when Kansai will finally sink, so engineers will have to keep coming up with new ideas. Honestly, no one really cares about this. In 2020, Kansai ranked 10th in the world's best airport list by Skytrax and won awards for Best Staff in Asia and Best Airport in the World for baggage delivery. This constantly sinking airport, for example, in 2016 welcomed over 26 million passengers, making it one of the 30 busiest airports in Asia. In 2019, by the way, after that typhoon in 2018, it took in 31.9 million passengers. No one was worried about anything. Which makes sense. It's an airport, not a place you need to live in, and over a few hours or at worst a few days, there's little chance it'll get flooded. In addition, in 2021, the reconstruction of the first terminal began. A new internal zone on the second floor was opened in 2022, then a new international departure area was completed in 2023, and by 2025, they plan to finish the screening area on the fourth floor and the international waiting lounges on the third. The entire reconstruction is scheduled to be completed in 2026, with the opening of the northern and southern commercial spaces in the international departure area. All this will allow the airport to welcome 40 million passengers a year. After this reconstruction, it's unlikely the airport will make it into any major rankings alongside other places that handle more than 50 million passengers a year. However, even without that, Kansai has already become one of the most important projects in human history. At least one reason for earning this title is already clear. It was the first airport built not on land like you'd expect, but on water. But that's not all, since now there are many other water airports around the world that learned from the sinking Kansai. For example, based on his designs, the Hong Kong International Airport was built. It's now the largest cargo airport in the world, as well as one of the busiest in terms of passenger traffic. In 2019, it handled 71 million passengers. The reasons for building were pretty much the same. Hong Kong was growing, and there was nowhere to expand the existing Kai Tak Airport. It was right in the middle of the city. As we've already mentioned, the planes at Atami Airport in Osaka annoyed the locals with their noise. But you haven't yet seen the photos taken in Hong Kong when Kai Tak was still in operation. There, planes literally flew right over people's heads. You could look out the window and see a plane passing by just a few feet away. The Hong Kong airport, built in 1998, isn't located entirely on man-made islands. 2 small islands near Hong Kong were conveniently located, and no one needed them for anything else, so in 1991 they started leveling them, then filled them in and built everything needed to handle the huge number of passengers and planes. Where did the Japanese developments come into play here? The thing is, for the new Hong Kong airport, they reclaimed an additional 3.6 square miles of nearby seabed. Besides the Hong Kong airport, Kansai has become the knowledge base for many other flood-related projects. But it's probably not going to cheer up those who know what the future has in store for Kansai Airport and possibly all similar sites.